Content Podcast, Episode 168. Community artist and founder and executive director of Earth Celebrations, Felicia Young.
So that became my initial quest, and it was in the 80s, to sort of a reaction against the commercial art world and trying to say, well, how can art participate in a functional way to connect not just art-educated people, but our overall communities on issues, affecting them with that have meaning and purpose. And can we just speak about these issues, or can we actually have it be transformative in some way to actually lead to some kind of change, whether it's social change or policy change, change within the community, by just being able to bring people together and get them working together.
Felicia Young runs Earth Celebrations, a nonprofit organization engaging communities to effect ecological and social change through the arts. Felicia has developed a methodology utilizing the arts and the theatrical pageant art form, a kind of street art, along with civic engagement and activism, among other things. She's a third-generation New Yorker with deep roots in the city of New York, as well as much inspiration from the festival ceremonies and mythic dramas from her mother's native land of India. I've never met Felicia in person, but I know about her work over the years by viewing social media such as the YouTube video Celebrations, director Felicia Young, 30 years of cultural organizing for ecological change. And I've put the link in the episode notes to this video. I was moved by Felicia's response to the question I ask all of my guests this season about how to prepare for the end of the world as we know it. And in particular, I was interested by her response to the issue of doom and gloom and defeatism.
I don't just see it as doom and gloom, because I'm directly and have been directly involved in 30 years of local people who've just moved forward with implementing these solutions without waiting for the government. But my involvement has always been on sort of the community level, the grassroots level. And on that, I'm encouraged. Where I'm afraid is the overall political system, where we see our elected officials owned by the industries that are doing all of the polluting and controlling, the bigger picture. But are we just going to be paralyzed because they're doing the wrong thing and not go ahead with what we know is right?
So this is the first in a series of conversations about one of my favorite art forms, community engaged arts, and one that I think will be especially important and useful in the future. Hey, Felicia, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be here.
I've seen your name so many times in, events in New York City, and I have to admit I have a soft spot for community engaged arts. I've always loved that practice, and when I was at Canada Council, I was involved, in funding it. And so when I see the body of work you've done, I'm sure you have lots of experience and knowledge to share with our listeners about art in the ecological crisis, but more specifically community engagement and some of the strategies you guys have done. And we won't have time to talk all about it, but why don't we start with just an introduction, give listeners an idea of where you come from, what you do, and then we'll get into some of the recent projects you've done. So Felicia, who are you?
I was an artist and also had studied art history. And, this for me really started very early on, even while in high school. And luckily, being in New York City, I interned at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and that in the African wing. And that was the first time that I started recognizing, well, these objects or masks or costumes really weren't created to be seen within the context of a museum. So they were part of socially functional ceremonies and rituals, and they had a purpose within that community. So that became my initial quest, and it was in the 80s, to sort of a reaction against the commercial art world and trying to say, well, how can art participate in a functional way to connect not just art educated people, but our overall communities on issues, affecting them with that have meaning and purpose. And can we just speak about these issues, or can we actually have it be transformative in some way to actually lead to some kind of change, whether it's social change or policy change, change within the community, by just being able to bring people together and get them working together on these issues. So I started looking at what kind of art form that would take. And, it's not going to just be a painting, or it's not just going to be a performance in a theater, and started looking at the theatrical pageant as an art form. So a couple of major influences on the Lower East Side, the neighborhood in which I'm in, there had been theatrical pageants, these sort of outdoor processionals, large scale sort of history and storytelling that was going on in the early 1900s on the Lower East Side as a way of bringing the diverse immigrant population together, redefining the new America. There were protest pageants as well. And then I'm half Indian, even though I don't look it. My mother is actually from India and had gone to India and documented. They have a long tradition of thousands of years of mythic dramas enacted over entire cities that usually tell religious stories or stories of historical purpose, but also with the function of maybe bringing together the diversity of different castes and community people together, sort of a peacemaking gesture. So I had documented this one festival there, and that was when I came back to New York after that in 1989. And that I would just said, that's it, that's the art form I want to use. And it marked all the boxes for me because it happens out in the public realm. It takes place across the neighborhood. It tells the stories of that community. It's embedded within the sites. And it's participatory in that it's not just professional artists, but community people themselves can play a role in both creating as well as enacting it. And it involves all the arts. So it's music, dance, theater, poetry, and visual art. And it's enacted. It tells the story. In the case when I did the first really major pageant, I had done a few smaller ones, but was the procession to save the community gardens. So the community gardens within the Lower East Side in the early 90s were endangered. We had already lost Adam Purple's Garden of Eden that was even featured in National Geographic. And that was down the street from me. And there were over 60 community gardens in the neighborhood. And I said at that time, well, what happened to the Garden of Eden? And it would be horrible if this happens now as development interests started picking up on the Lower East Side to all of the gardens. And we lost these gardens that were created out of rubble-strewn vacant lots and city neglect out of the 70s. And it was the poor low-income community that said, we're sick of living in a dump of these vacant lots with car parts, even dead bodies, with the that the whole thing of how those gardens got created out of city neglect, with the community coming together and just clearing out the garbage, clearing out the rubble, saying we're going to do it for ourselves. We're not going to just live in a dump because the city's forgotten about us. And that was what was horrible. So 25 years goes by, and finally the economics in the city, you had the crash in 87 that had sort of pushed things out into the 90s. But then as things were picking up in the 90s, they started targeting the gardens, and they would have destroyed every single one of them. And that was when I said, well, what can I do? And, it was all at the same time. So I put it all together. That's it. I'll do a pageant. I mean, this is the time before the internet, before cell phones. I mean, unless you got into the New York Times, which we did by 92, but yeah, how do you tell your story out there? I mean, people who lived on Third Avenue didn't even realize what was going on in Avenue A. I mean, the world was a very different place in terms of how you got your information. So the procession that went all day long to about 48, 45 different gardens told the stories of those gardens. We did memorials at the ones that had been lost, built the effort and the movement. I mean, it connected each garden to each other. It, through the arts, formed a coalition. And then it told the story of what the history was of each of these sites and the struggle that was happening with development interests at play. So by the end of the first year, people were already planning for the next year. And then over the course of the next few years, we realized, well, besides the pageant, let's organize an actual coalition. Let's do mapping. Let's go to City Hall. Let's, work on this in with different, like coalition of people working on different aspects that we needed to define. I mean, there was a press committee, a mapping committee, an outreach committee, and all the gardeners and diverse community people started coming together. Then it got endangered citywide with Mayor Giuliani in 1996 announcing he wasn't just going after the gardens on the Lower East Side. Now it was all the boroughs. It was the Bronx, Brooklyn, Upper West Side, Harlem. And from an article that I had read, I reached out. That time you could actually call information and get people's phone numbers, and they pick up landlines. And I told these people, well, we've been organizing for years on the Lower East Side. It's happening in Harlem, it's happening in the Bronx, so let's get together. And that was a huge turning point. So that was where people from all the boroughs came. We formed a citywide coalition. And that was really where overnight, all of a sudden, all the politicians and some of the philanthropists and people have been sitting on the sidelines because we were just sort of a neighborhood thing, started paying attention. Oh my gosh, you've got the entire representation of the city now as a unified voice. And yeah, I mean, the Rockefellers got involved. You had Bette Midler, who then got involved. And she was even on Larry King Live talking about, she put in over $1 million to buy out some gardens into a land trust in 99. So it got that kind of attention, all of a sudden. And we were able, with the transition with Bloomberg coming in as mayor, to have him settle it and move hundreds of gardens into the Parks Department, where they're protected at least from development. But that was an incredible example. It took 15 years, but of how you can do a community arts project and you get incremental results along the way. And sometimes, you can luck out with that kind of major policy change. It's not all guaranteed, but that was an incredible example. And then after, the bulk of the gardens were under protection, I said, well, am I just going to keep doing the same thing, or can we take these strategies and apply it to other issues? So then I looked over on the Hudson River waterfront, and there was lots of discussion. It was after Al Gore's film Inconvenient Truth that showed Lower Manhattan sinking under the rising rivers. So I did a Hudson River pageant that talked about climate impacts, went along the west side in downtown Manhattan. And then also went back to India, to that city, Madurai, that had inspired me with their pageants, and saw 25 years later how polluted the river had become, and also impacted by climate in this region in India. So a lot of the year, there's no water in the river at all. It's a complete dry riverbed. So I said, well, I took their art form and applied it and got all these results in New York. They wouldn't be taking something from the West and applying it. This is their own indigenous art form. Maybe they could do something to, raise awareness and engage and activate people on this issue, because that wasn't happening. So I took the idea to the largest NGO in the city, and they said, absolutely, let's do it. But now you raise half the money in New York. And I got this professor, Geeta Mehta from Columbia University's architecture department, who had an organization, Asia Initiatives, and she put some money in and partnered on the project. And then Columbia University got involved, and they ended up bringing students of architecture and urban planning to do an exchange program in India with architecture students there. And out of that whole project, that I literally had to go back and forth to India like 4 or 5 different times. I had to remote through, at the time, we didn't even have Zoom. I was doing Skype calls with the local director, sort of directing him on this. But a similar process, months of basically community building, partnership building, bringing different sectors from farmers, the religious organizations, cultural organizations, people just living in shacks along the riverbed. So it brought all these different groups to the table, and then the mayor sort of embraced the project and sort of announced, well, now we're going to create the Vaigai River Restoration Trust. We're actually going to create sort of an entity and a panel to continue this work, because I wasn't going to move to India. We'll take it over. So it became an ongoing thing. I mean, that I'm no longer involved with, but eventually, several years down the road, they became because of all this attention to the Vaigai project, they got designated as a smart city of India with like billions of rupees for the actual river restoration. So it's still an ongoing thing that I'm no longer involved with.
What I'm hearing are fascinating stories of success. And I assume that art is at the heart of this because it's a cross-sectoral initiative, of course, and it influences public policy and so on. But that's what's interesting for me, is that the pageant and the art is what drives it, right? It what keeps it together. It's what not only instigates it, but has that been your experience, that people really love the artistic part and then that inspires them to do the other work?
Yeah, I think that the art is really an opening bridge because it's a safe place people can bring to it. I mean, in India, it was incredible because they had all of these amazing craft traditions, but it's an entry point. I mean, even when we do it in New York, we're not only getting artists, we're just getting other people who come and share and collaborate with the artists. But I think it's a fun entry point. It's educational. It's it's public culture, and it's from that, I think, opening of it's like a more accessible form of getting people to understand these more complex issues. I mean, if you were just saying, oh, we're going to have a meeting on the Vaigai River restoration, I think you'd get like, the serious government people involved, maybe the environmental groups that are there, but you wouldn't get the students, the schools, the cultural groups within a community. And I think everyone feels like in this, they have something they can share. There's a way to participate and there's a way they can express themselves. So, yeah, I found it to be effective. You don't control the outcome. So I always feel like what you have to do is just be committed to the process, and then whatever the outcomes are, come naturally.
Well, here in Canada, there is a Public Dream Society in Vancouver that did a lot of similar kind of work, and all around the world, there's pageantry and carnivals and
Mhm.
processions and that. And there's always when I was at the Canada Council, there was always a ill at ease feeling: is this art, or is this, social development? And I never questioned the fact that, artist-led projects were serious. They're sometimes process based, not product
Mhm.
based, but um, the theme of my season this year is the world has ended as we know it, which is something that comes from an article by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, and in a way it has. But you've been working at this for 30 years. How do you feel about the state of the world now and the role of art?
The state of the world is, I've been involved in environmental issues in a local way. I think at the time we were saying Save the Gardens, we're thinking about it in terms of the need for open space. I think now, especially after Hurricane Sandy and direct climate impacts in New York, that became a whole turning point for thinking about, well, the gardens, absorb the water. They provide all of this green infrastructure. They, sequester carbon. They give us clean air. And then there are bioswales and pollinator gardens and sustainable urban agriculture and all of the urban climate solutions that are not just imagined, but actually exist. So I think that became, when I think about the world as we know it, I don't just see it as doom and gloom, because I'm directly and have been directly involved in 30 years of local people who've just moved forward with implementing these solutions, without waiting for the government. And the government's coming along because it has its own big billions of dollars of infrastructure projects that it's doing as well. So, but my involvement has always been on sort of the community level, the grassroots level. And on that, I'm encouraged. Where I'm afraid is the overall political system, where we see our elected officials owned by the industries that are doing all of the polluting and controlling, the bigger picture. But are we just going to be paralyzed because they're doing the wrong thing and not go ahead with what we know is right? And I think that's what I'm seeing, is just community people who are committed to building a better world and doing what they can locally. And then I think, there's a meeting, because definitely city policy is trying to gear itself towards meeting these climate goals. You know, but yeah, I mean, like the COP meetings and all of that are so owned by these questionable interests. Yeah, on that level, I don't know. It would be very frustrating to operate, I think, on that level, because it does seem like a lot of greenwashing and not real. But the real action is happening. It's just not happening at those big tables. I think it's happening local.
Well, what I keep hearing from artists, and I've talked to them 2, 3 times a week, different artists from around the world, is we need to focus on the local, because that's where we can actually change things in terms of day-to-day work, but also network, and those things are happening. They're just not happening at the scale that is required. And yet there's artists everywhere in the world. And maybe if they joined forces, or at least knew about each other's experiences and efforts and strategies. And when I was reading your website, you talk a lot about cultural strategies, and you share a lot of information. So there's a body of work there that people can refer to. Do you have advice for artists who want to get involved or do more community-based social change? What are some of the things that they would need to keep in mind?
What I did was you look at your own neighborhood, what's happening, because everything, is it a river? Is it a park? Is it a polluting industry? And sometimes you have to be, my things have been largely affirmations, but in the case of the gardens, it was like, we want to show what these assets are because you're about to get rid of them. And obviously, over the time, there was a shift by the city in recognizing what they were about to lose. And with Mike Bloomberg, saying, we should preserve these. This is not to be gotten rid of. So you look in your own neighborhood, and then you really have to reach out to the stakeholders who are the different people within your community. Sometimes it's racial diversity, different groups of people that don't normally communicate, but there are groups that represent those varying interests. Cultural groups, environmental groups, activist groups, neighborhood block associations, community centers. So it takes a lot of meeting different people and saying, look, we all have this common thing happening in our neighborhood. If you care about it too, we have an idea. And you can it doesn't have to be a pageant. That was the form that I gravitated to because it could happen within the streets and within the public realm, not, an exhibition or a theater indoors. So to me, that worked well. And then, it's a process. I mean, you don't just professionally create something and then present it to the community. It's the process usually would involve months. How do you engage the community in the co-creation of something? Well, usually that's going to involve some period of time. We do about 3 months of workshops where you're having both professional artists within your community as well as inviting other people in. So how do you make that accessible? Not everybody who shows up to a workshop has art skills, but the artists that we work with have figured out ways of dissecting their projects to make it so that people can participate in, whether it's paper mache or working with clay or helping sew the pollinator costume together. All different people show up. And then it culminates in the enactment, and then you've got to involve the community in the telling of that story. And so I think the structure of the projects, it's nice if it can be really a framework, and then the community helps fill it in. So you're more of a conductor, facilitator, orchestrating, and bringing together this community voice, and allowing people to speak within this common vision, and over time, if you were like now, we shifted. So instead of it being Save the Gardens, the new pageant is the Ecological City Procession for Climate Solutions. So when I came back from India and looked at sort of an aerial view of the neighborhood and pulled back, I said, wow, well, had we not preserved the gardens, we wouldn't have all of these green infrastructure and urban climate solutions. But now we do, because we did that work 30 years ago. We now have these gardens that are providing all of these. So what's that story? And then I saw, well, it's not just the gardens. The Earth School has a green roof. The Sixth Street Community Center, where I'm based, has a rooftop bee farm. There were people also trying to do rooftop solar projects. And then you had the whole post-Hurricane Sandy East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, which was engaging the community on a huge federally funded, largest redevelopment plan in New York's history, to basically build up Lower Manhattan, by like 10 feet. So that's actually going on right now. And it's a little controversial because they involved the community in one plan and then dismissed that plan. And it's kind of a destructive plan. It knocked down like all the trees, and they're basically bringing in landfill and like building up a wall with a park on top of it. So not everybody is happy about that, but it's happening. And yeah, so if you looked at that aerial view, it was gardens, neighborhood, and what's happening on the waterfront told this new story of climate solutions that were embedded. So we identified like 13 gardens and other sites, like 21 different sites, and a 10-mile route from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. with ceremonies and performances at each of the sites that would highlight the climate solution or green infrastructure feature that that garden has. Because a lot of people walk by a garden and they see trees and they're like, oh, that's beautiful, but they don't really see it in terms of, oh, that has a water harvesting pond, or that one's doing a pollinator garden, and that one's doing sustainable agriculture and vertical farming. And together it comprises this model sustainable urban ecosystem.
Well, we could go on and on. I like the idea that you planted seeds 30 years ago and now you see the benefits of them, not knowing whether it would work. And I'm sure you're planting more seeds now. I like that sort of parallel with gardening and growing. And there's so much potential for the arts also in regenerative spaces, in different ways, cultural regeneration and ecological regeneration. But I know you're very busy, Felicia, and I just want to thank you for that. And before ending, I always ask my guests if they're reading something or if there's something they've experienced recently that they want to recommend, a book or podcast or a film that's touchy recently that you would recommend to our listeners.
Well, with podcasts, the Center for Artistic Activism in New York, they have a lot, sort of a catalog of interviews that cover this. I mean, I'm one of them. William Cleveland
Yeah, I
uh,
know.
is another one who also, has a series of podcasts, also straddling community engagement and the arts. Um, yeah, so it's great to be included and also to discover what other people are doing. I'm also part of a group called Eco Art Space. And as that group also publishes books, also online, and that group is, I don't know if it's international, but it's pretty national across the
It,
country.
it is because I'm part of it as well.
Oh, you're part of it, so
We
it's
do we do a
international.
sound dialogue
Oh, you
every
are
month.
part of it.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great group. And that also, I mean, not everybody is doing community-based, community engaged art, but it's definitely environmental. So yeah, these are all, I think, interesting groups to go to. There's another artists and climate change group that I post in the Facebook part of it, but that also is a lot of sharing a place that people who are interested in this kind of work could go to discover what's happening. And that's, I think, international too.
Yeah. Well, Chantal Bilodeau has done a lot of
Yeah.
work and she was on my podcast. I did a lot of podcast recordings during COVID, of course, because
Mhm.
we were all at home. But recently I've been doing panels and trying to get as many different voices heard. And I'm going to do a series on community-based arts. And you're the first in that series because I really believe in that art form as a way to mobilize communities, to get people to care and to engage with complex issues, right? Because there's so many resources that are being called upon in any given community. So I really appreciate the stories you told today, and I encourage people. I'll put all those links in the episode notes. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to just say before we end, Felicia?
I'm glad that there's attention being given to the importance of community engaged arts for so many years. You know, people within the arts and funders, you know, sort of like, well, what are you doing? Because it's not in a gallery, and it's not in a theater, and it's in the streets, and there's some professionals, and then they're non-professionals, and it's not like how many performances do you create, but what is your process? And they weren't used to looking at it that way. It's like if you were a theater group, you had to produce a presenter, like 25 professional performances. It wasn't about using the arts in this way. But, you know, that took about 20 years, but eventually it now has its own domain. And even the big institutions are all shifting to all say they do community engaged arts. So big institution now has to partner with community based groups. So that's good. And, you know, this year we got the NEA Challenge America grant. So I never had even applied for an NEA because it was inaccessible. You know, the grants were too complicated for somebody who was a you know, grants person to put together a government grant like that. But they created now something exactly geared to this that's a lot easier for community-based groups that are not big institutions. And luckily, the first time I applied, which was this past year, you know, we lucked out and we got it. So it's not a huge amount of money, but hopefully that'll help.
Well, one of my thoughts is that as the world goes through unfortunate collapse because there are ecological systems collapsing and eventually some societal systems will also change and collapse. I think the legacy of community-based arts will be really useful in communities that we won't be starting from scratch. We will have known stories and ways of collaborating within communities, which can also avoid tensions, you know, when people get together and sing a song or do a mural or whatever the participative art form is. There's a real legacy there that I think we need to remember, this cultural memory. We need to remember all the art, of course, but including the community-based practices that have been going on for years and years and years, sometimes in obscurity and sometimes with a lot of visibility and tangible results. Like you said today, you know, things actually changed as a result of these artworks. So thank you for your work and thank you for our
Thank you.
conversation today, and we'll talk again.
Okay, cool. Nice. See you. Yeah, I
Um,
also have a good 4-minute video summary.
okay.
And you know, because it's like you can talk about these things, but it would be nice to be able for somebody to see it, and then you could provide the YouTube link if people want to watch the whole